You are listening to Exploring Clean Energy, where we uncover the ideas, innovations, and projects powering our sustainable future. I'm Andy Marsland. Welcome to the show. I'm thrilled to welcome our guest today, Michael van Baarle, who's the founder and CEO of ABEL Energy. So a very warm welcome, Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Andy.
Thanks for being on the Clean Energy podcast. So let's get straight into it then. Could you give the listeners and viewers an overview of ABEL Energy?
Sure. So ABEL Energy, really, the concept started about 10 years ago, although you might argue that, it was conceived even before that in my coal days when I was involved in a coal to liquids company. And one of the first things we realised that we could make from coal was methanol. And at that time, you didn't see a lot of it, but that's since then. China has become a huge coal to methanol producer. But about 10 years ago, I thought, having spent most of my life, like most people in Queensland, in the fossil fuel industry in one way or another, as a lawyer and then directly, I thought the future here is to see if we can make something like methanol renewably. And the more I thought about it, the more I read about it, the more persuaded I was that the future for a very simple liquid alcohol like methanol was the best bet that I could think of as far as what does our future look like to the extent we need liquids and materials.
Yeah. And so, taking a step back, so some of the audience might not know what methanol is. Can you give an overview of what is methanol, what's its chemical composition, and what are some of the uses of methanol?
Sure. Well, it's actually very similar to ethanol. It's a close chemical cousin, except instead of having two carbon atoms like ethanol does, it only has the one. So it's the simplest alcohol building block. It's one of the simplest chemicals that's a liquid. So, for example, CH₃, people might know, is methane. Add an oxygen, and you've got methanol, and that has. There's two things about that that are very, very important. One is it is actually a liquid, an easy to handle liquid, and that means that things like storage and transportation is so much easier than, say, if it were a gas. And secondly, the fact that it is such a simple structure means that you can use it as a building block for a whole range of other things, and that's typically how methanol is used today. It's a building block for other chemicals, acetic acid, formaldehyde, that's typically used. In fact, used in thousands of things around us. In fact, in this room with the sealants and with the plastics and stuff, you find there's probably a fair bit of methanol in a lot of the things just in this studio.
And paints as well, I believe.
Paints, pharmaceuticals. It really is one of those. It's a bit like petrochemicals. If you start to think about what's made out of petrochemicals, methanol is similar. Mm-hmm. So many things either use methanol to one degree or another. So that material, and that was always the thinking that I and my colleagues thought. At the end of the day, we need carbon-based building blocks for most of the things that we use in our daily life.
Yeah. And how do we green those up, I guess? And in the heavy transportation sector, so shipping, for example, to green up the shipping sector, probably looking at, initially as a kind of, stop LNG bunkering, perhaps, as a kind of, short-term solution, and then methanol and ammonia. I guess, different companies are looking at different options.
It's actually one of the features of methanol is its versatility. So as I described, it's the building block for a lot of carbon-based chemicals that we use pretty much, for almost every second thing that we look at. But it is actually a very high-octane, high-performance racing fuel. That's the other thing that's used for today is in drag racing.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So it's a bit like people saying it's a bit like putting F1 fuel into your ship. When you if you start looking at at using as a shipping fuel. But funnily enough, the reason that methanol was first popularized as a shipping fuel was not to reduce the greenhouse gas intensity of it. It was because it was much cleaner burning than fuel oil and others. So ships coming into busy port cities like Barcelona or Rotterdam or even Sydney Harbour, burning heavy fuel oil would create a lot of pollution. And um, eventually, some of the cities started to clamp down on this, and they had these so-called sulfur emission control areas, and you weren't allowed to burn that fuel coming into the harbour. You had to burn something cleaner. Whereas with methanol, you've got pretty much the cleanest burning liquid that exists.
Yes.
So that was, but then as things progressed, people said, oh, well, if we can make it renewably, not only have we a much cleaner burning fuel that doesn't need all the particulate filters and all the other stuff that, you typically need with dirtier fuels, we can also make it renewably, and that will reduce the carbon intensity, the greenhouse gas intensity of the fuel.
Yeah, fantastic. And we've spoken about this a few times on previous episodes about effectively the sludge that the shipping industry is using at the moment. I think somewhere in the region of all global emissions are about 3 or 4%.
About 3%. That's right.
3% from the shipping industry.
Yep.
So methanol. Got to look at my notes here. CH₃OH and
Yes.
then ammonia, NH3. So what happens with methanol for the carbon then once it's used? Because I guess it's kind of carbon neutral rather than ammonia doesn't have that carbon element in.
Yes, that's right. Well, carbon does a couple of things. It gives you density, energy density, and it gives you a liquid. Very hard to have that without carbon. NH3, obviously, ammonia is a gas. And that's very profound in the way that carbon can then be, or that methanol can then be used. But the other thing to bear in mind is that because it is, what you are using carbon is a carbon-based molecule, you've then got to find a sustainable source of carbon, and ideally a scalable source of carbon as well, because there's no point having a small experimental plant or one or two ships. If you're going to decarbonize or reduce the greenhouse gas intensity of shipping, you've got to be able to do this at scale. And that's then the challenge. Where do you get carbon? And there are essentially only three places on the surface of the Earth where you can get carbon: biomass, the atmosphere, and the ocean. That's it. You can't invent carbon or pull it out of space. You've got to basically find your carbon on the surface of the Earth from those three places. And of course, you can continue to dig for carbon, like coal and oil and gas. But if we're going to start moving away from that, then they're the options. So that then raises a lot of issues. I mean, you don't want to be using unsustainable carbon. You've got to be careful about, for instance, we would never use native forestry as a carbon source, for example, because it's important that we reduce the footprint of our industry. We're not looking to reduce the biodiversity, for example. That's extremely important. So you have to find sustainable source of carbon, initially biomass, and then eventually, I think, probably atmospheric CO2.
Yeah, which brings us on quite nicely. Let's talk about ABEL Energy's flagship project, I guess you call it, Bell Bay. So you talked about needing biomass, sufficient scale. Well, how big is the project? Where is it? Could you give the audience a bit of an overview of where you're up to?
So the background to it was that I personally went around all the East Coast, right as far from Cairns down to Adelaide, trying to find renewable electricity, a source of carbon, those very basic things, and then eventually came to Bell Bay and was just blown away by the fact that not only did Tasmania have virtually a green power grid already because of its hydro and a bit of wind. But there at Bell Bay, we were in the centre of this plantation forestry industry, where you had waste material, in some cases being burnt.
Oh, really?
And I thought, wow, this is an opportunity. This is something you very rarely see. And then on top of that, there was one particular site that we had our eye on, which had its own deep water shipping berth. And that was the old Bell Bay Power Station.
Oh, yeah.
And so it took a while to bring it all together, but we ultimately ended up buying that power station. And in an arrangement with Hydro Tasmania, they are currently completing the demolition of the old power station. And there you have one of those very rare locations where it already has a power connection. It has its own deep water berth for for export. It's surrounded by the forestry industry. It has a workforce in place. It has a very supportive industrial community, as well as a lot of there's a lot of people who live around the area. It's about 72,000 people in that general area. So it's a wonderful
Fantastic
confluence.
location.
Yes,
Yes.
I mean, you'll never probably. I doubt whether there's ever going to be another site like it in Australia. Everywhere else you go has to have a bit more of a compromise on one or other of those factors. But that's just one of those, Goldilocks sites that,
How did you come upon that? Is that just from kind of keep searching, and then this one kind
Well,
of
as I say,
landed?
I'd already looked extensively around Australia for a
Mm.
couple of years. And so when I saw that site, immediately, the bell started ringing. And then I was quite fortunate that Hydro Tasmania I had spoken to about it. And they said, oh, we've got a site, an old power station site you might be interested in. Shall we go and have a look at it? So that was in March 2019. That was the first time I saw the old Bilbo power station right on the water there. And really after that, I always had an eye. It took a while, I have to say, we got some funding from the Tasmanian government for a feasibility study, which we did with ThyssenKrupp. One of my colleagues joined at that time, a chemical engineer, and we started looking at it. And also around that time was when a lot of things, the market started to evolve, because all of a sudden in 2021, AP Moller Maersk, the big Danish shipping company, came out and said, we've decided that the best way forward for the ship, for fuels for our shipping industry is methanol, green methanol. For the reasons I explained earlier, very clean burning, can be made renewably at scale, reduce the carbon
Liquid,
intensity.
low toxicity.
Very low toxicity. If you spill it a bit into water, for example, it has a relatively benign effect, much more benign compared to, say, oil or diesel or fuel oil or ammonia. It mixes instantly with water and biodegrades. So it's one of those, they set it out beautifully in a series of YouTube clips.
I think I might have seen those about the Maersk fleet. That's
Yeah,
how many ships are
really
they up
well
to now? And some of
explained.
these are huge, aren't they? Big
Yeah, they
container
are.
ships.
They've tended to focus their new builds on these very large box ships that can't actually even come to Australia. They typically ply the route between, Shanghai, Singapore, and say Rotterdam, Hamburg. Those sort of, and they're designed specifically to, move goods at massive scale, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of goods and containers on those ships. And also, one of the things that they were able to do was to redesign the ship to have slightly bigger tanks, because methanol only has half the energy density of heavy fuel oil. So to get the same, distance, you need a bigger tank. And they were able to design the tanks and so forth in a way that they actually lost very little, if any, cargo space.
Oh, great.
So they did a massive redesign of a whole, not just of the fuel tanks, but a whole range of other, improvements on the typical ship design. So the wheelhouse, for example, is right at the front instead of being sort of 3/4 back and that sort of stuff.
Yeah. How many ships have Maersk got now?
So Maersk have brought out a dozen of their around 16,000 20-foot container unit ships. And they've just started building another dozen 17,500. And bearing in mind, those ships are too big for any port in Australia. The biggest ship that steams into Melbourne might be, if they're lucky, 13,000 TEUs or 20-foot units.
Yep.
So these, I say, these are for the very big, deep water ports and routes going, long distances. So they've got this economy of scale, if you like.
Yeah. I know we're jumping around a bit, but as you mentioned it, if the majority of the shipping routes or major shipping routes are not out of Australia, what's the kind of game plan in terms of getting your Bell Bay methanol up to wherever the kind of refueling? Is it Singapore or wherever the
Well, Singapore is the world's
hub?
biggest refueling, or what they call bunkering hub. To give you an idea, of the 300 million tonnes of fuel oil that is used today in shipping globally, 50 million tonnes of that would be used for fueling in Singapore.
Yeah, well,
it's bigger than the next 3 or 4, and it's not the biggest port necessarily, but it is by far the biggest bunkering hub in the world. So it's and it's really on our doorstep in many ways. So to that extent, Australia is quite well positioned. But there's another significance to that, and that is that the most stringent rules around greenhouse gas reduction has come out of Europe. But of course, the ships going to Europe, as soon as they hit a European port, they have to comply with those stringent rules, what's called the Fuel EU Maritime and the emissions trading system in Europe. So they have to ideally find a fuel in Singapore that will comply with um, their obligations when they hit the European port. So in that, even though people might say, "Oh, well, Europe's a long way away" or whatever, in fact, it's very impactful for us because we have potentially buyers in, who will use Singapore for refueling for the ships that are going to Europe.
Yeah. And how big's Bell Bay going to be? How many thousands of tons?
It's 360,000 tonnes a
Mm.
year is the where we've got to. We actually started much smaller. We started with a 60,000 a year model,
Okay. Yeah.
and then we went to 75,000 tonnes, and then that's when Maersk suddenly came out and said, "Oh, we need millions of tonnes by 2030 and 2035," and we thought, "Oh." And as what we found was when we did our design work and our modelling, we found that as we increased the output of the model, the production model, our costs came down quite dramatically.
Mm.
So we were very incentivized to work at, what's the biggest output model that we could design there, and we ultimately got as far as 360 because that's what a single standard gasification unit from America was going to be able to do. If we wanted to go beyond that, we would have to buy a second unit. And these are, $400 or $500 million units. So,
Wow.
yeah.
Have you got the land capacity to do that in the future?
We have the land capacity to do that. That's not a problem.
Mm.
It's just, as I say, the constraint is the gasifier. And I suppose, ideally, you would typically, if you're designing these sort of things and building them, you'd try and work out how you might add a second unit.
Mm-hmm.
Those sort of things. That might be a little bit of a challenge, but there is room there for some ideas. I mean, there's also an emerging technology converting methanol to sustainable aviation fuel, to synthetic kerosene. And so I think when we're building these units, we would be mindful of the fact that we might want to add something like a SAF unit
Oh, interesting.
on there as well.
Like you say, there's kind of so many options, isn't there?
Very versatile. It's probably one of the most versatile carbon-based liquids that you can imagine.
Mm. Why do you think more companies aren't doing this? Do you think it's the kind of location, as you touched upon, that's quite challenging to get everything to stack up?
It's a very good question, Andy, and I think the reason is that Australia just isn't very familiar with methanol. We stopped producing any sort of methanol, even from natural gas, about 10 years ago. By contrast, our neighbours, New Zealand, have been in the past one of the biggest methanol producing and exporting centres in the world.
Mm.
That's now becoming a bit of an issue because their gas reserves are dwindling. So they've come off their highs, if you like. But for many decades, New Zealand had a massive methanol exporting industry. In fact, over half of New Zealand's gas was exported not as LNG, as we do in Australia, but as methanol.
Wow.
It was a way of, if you like, monetising export natural gas. Gas is too difficult by itself. You have to liquefy it one way or another. Another way of, of course, you could do ammonia as well, but New Zealand did methanol. And so, but if you contrast that with what's happening in China, China is very familiar with methanol, and there are like 4 or 5 green or recycled methanol plants already up and running, and there are another 18 under construction. So they are really going for
Quite
green
advanced.
methanol in a big way.
Yes.
Yeah, they're paving the way, and they're giving the shipping industry the comfort that there is supply coming online, because even now, the availability of green methanol is quite limited. So it's very important that, if they're going to keep building the ships, they have to be able to see, and these are dual fuel ships too, so they can run on other fuels, other liquid fuels, but ideally they're designed really to take advantage of methanol.
Yeah. What stage are you at with Bell Bay then? I think you mentioned that the power station is currently being demolished.
Yeah, so the stage that Bell Bay is at is there's the what's called a feasibility study was finished in a few years ago. We then did a pre-feed or front-end engineering design study, which was very encouraging. So we're now really ready to start front-end engineering design, feed, as it's commonly known,
Hmm.
and that's where we sit at the moment. Now that requires a fair addition of capital, and really this is where we've run into a little bit of delay in the sense that it's quite difficult to raise tens of millions of dollars we need capital together with government agencies and so forth who have expressed the desire to help us, but we still need those capital partners to come on board. They may be offtake, they may be interested in offtake, like some of the Japanese companies, or they may just see this as something that they want to do to monetize, for example, Australian renewable electricity, because we use a lot of electricity in our plants. But in any event, getting that capital, and particularly capital in a market which is not familiar with methanol, has been quite challenging for us.
Yes, yeah. Obviously, Tasmania's got an excess of energy over there at the moment with the hydro. Um, Thinking further ahead, I mean, there's talks of getting a power cable from Tasmania to the mainland, and
Mm.
will that kind of divert some of the power that you guys were after, or is it?
Yeah, look, it's. I mean, we're obviously we work closely with all the Tasmanian agencies, so we're pretty familiar with impacts and so forth. I think from the Tasmanian point of view, they really want to see this project succeed.
Mm,
It's the only survivor of the whole hydrogen cycle that we've seen. There were 4 or 5 projects at Bell Bay at one point.
mm.
Bell Bay Power Fuels, our project, is the only surviving project, and I think that speaks to the inherent logic.
I was going to say, yeah, yeah. We've seen so many projects drop off, and you
Yeah.
should be, very proud and have a lot of optimism that you're one of kind of remaining few, I guess.
Yes, yes. We feel very fortunate that we feel like we've made the right call
Mm,
as to what to do with hydrogen, for example. Um, and we were lucky, to be honest. There's always a bit of luck involved, but the fact that the shipping industry really started to push the methanol story and to build the new methanol ships, was to our great advantage. And also things like the Fuel EU Maritime European, which provided a price point which it meant that we could get the green premium that we needed um, to get, build the business case for green methanol. But I think with Tassie, I think it is a Team Tassie type approach down there. I mean, they need. There's a lot of people very keen to see Project Marinus succeed, but they also want to see us succeed.
mm.
So, um, yeah, and I think Project Marinus will come online a little bit later than Bell Bay Power Fuels.
Yes, yeah.
So the early move is in wind and new wind farms and so forth. We can supply that load that they won't have for a few more years when Marinus comes online.
When do you think your project will be operational?
So we're aiming for 2029, 2030.
Mm,
That's the sort of time frame,
yeah.
and so it's not it's actually not that far away. So we really have to crack on with feed, to meet that sort of timeline.
Yeah, there's a fair degree of inputs that we touched upon a few already. The biofuels, the energy inputs, the water component that you need
Mm,
to separate the water into get the hydrogen element
sure.
for the methanol.
I mean, most of the water we need, frankly, is not for hydrogen; it's for cooling.
Oh right, okay.
So we need, of course, we need hydrogen. We need water for hydrogen, but the volumes for cooling are more demanding than for the hydrogen itself.
Yeah, does that need to be treated for cooling, or can you just use normal
No,
use?
we could, in theory, use salt water. In fact,
Mm.
the power station was cooled using water. When I say salt water, brackish water from the Tamar estuary.
All right.
Um, but we're looking at a range of options, around water. It's one of those things. Is although we don't need a lot of it by agricultural standards, you still need it.
Mm.
So it's you can't ignore it. You've got to make sure that you've got a water supply coming online in time for your project commencement.
Yeah, and I saw that you'd selected CH₃OH for your electrolyser
Yes.
OEM. So yeah, what was the kind of decision process to go with
Oh,
them?
look, we for a project like this, first of a kind, and particularly in Australia, we really needed bankable um, equipment
Yes.
and bankable processes, and we think that ThyssenKrupp at the moment is is one of the only, if not the only, bankable electrolyzer. I mean, I personally, having visited the various ThyssenKrupp facilities, I just love the simplicity of it. They've been doing it for decades. It's a 100-year-old technology. The first big electrolyzer plant was built in Norway in 1924. So it's actually been through its century anniversary. Um, and ThyssenKrupp have been basically building and deploying electrolyzers for the chlor-alkali business, where they electrolyze salty water to make chlorine for decades, and building them at the sort of scale we're looking at. So, of course, there's lots of new technologies coming online, at various scales, pilot scale, you know, demonstration scale. We see all that as a good thing. But today, the only bankable technology that we can get any comfort around at the moment is ThyssenKrupp Nucera.
Yeah. So having that level of certainty and minimizing your risk.
Yes, exactly. We're already seen as a risky project because of the fact that we are first of a kind, and it's a bit it's a nuanced thing because each component of our project is in many cases century old technology. Gasification, all of our gas in Brisbane and around the world was based on gasification of coal for a long, long time
Mhm.
and reticulated through the city. So that's how old it is. And but of course, building it at a certain scale, at a large scale, and using biomass instead of coal, and there's all these, if you like, slightly different things about that particular technology, which I would describe as probably the most. It's the technology that carries the most risk from a bankability point of view, because there are no. Well, there are now. They've only just started, but there are very few gasification units of the scale that we're looking at around the world today. They're typically a much smaller scale.
Mm.
Mm.
And your other project in Townsville?
Yes, so we a few years ago we approached the port of Townsville, and we tried to glean what sort of appetite there might be for methanol. It's on the barrier reef, so there's all the pollution issues and things are particularly important in a port like Townsville. And also there was a lot of new power infrastructure coming online in Townsville, Copper String 2.0 and so forth. And we really felt that the fact that there was this need for a big load up there, like compared to say Gladstone, which already has very big loads in the smelters and so forth. You didn't have that with Townsville, and so we thought it was a nice fit. And also, of course, being in the tropics, stuff grows fast. So getting biomass up there, we felt was, fundamentally, it was a really good place to find biomass,
Yeah. So
because
what's that primarily? Is it the sugarcane waste?
there is a couple of different possibilities. Sugarcane waste is one of them, um, but there are other possibilities. As long as we're not using food or feed crops,
Hmm.
that's where we have to draw the line, because particularly, I mean, apart from our own philosophy, the European regulations require that no food or feed crops be used in order to get the full benefit of the Fuel EU maritime regulation.
Yeah.
Um, and the other thing about that is that we've now got the International Maritime Organization next month voting on their own greenhouse gas reduction rules, what they call their net zero framework. And so what we always felt was that, we could try to sort of mold our process around what the rules are today, but we felt that was a short-sighted approach, because we've got a 30-year project. We may as well design the greenest thing the most sustainable thing we can do today, in the knowledge that over time the rules will tighten, and that even if we could get away with something less sustainable in the short term, it was a project risk that we shouldn't
Yeah.
be
Smart.
taking. Yes.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, then, like what stage is this Townsville project up to? And I guess my second question was, how have you found the policy incentives then to help those projects along?
Yeah, so the Townsville project we've changed approach slightly for Townsville. At one point, we were very focused on finding a site and working, to that site and trying to get power to it and so forth. In more recent times, we've changed our approach and we think, no, that the most critical thing is finding a power partner
Mm.
in Townsville. And that's really where we are today, talking to a number of different renewable power producers, saying we want to, if you like, if possible, even have behind the meter renewable power generation coming into the plant. And we were inspired a lot by what was happening in China because that's what they were doing. And we thought, well, that's, instead of having a power purchase agreement and everyone trying to, you know, win, if you like, uh, at the expense of someone else, we thought, no, let's see if we can build an integrated project right from the panels and the turbines right through to the methanol production. And that way we've got all the levers that we need because in some ways a methanol plant is like a big reverse battery. It's very flexible. So you can ramp down the power consumption very dramatically, very quickly if power prices are high or the grid needs additional power. And we felt that in the future that's going to be more and more valuable. And that's something that we should aim for
Mm.
as a way of making the best use of it and of course, getting the most revenue as well, because when power prices are high, you know, uh, you don't make methanol at that point. You let the power stream through into the grid, and in fact, you make more money doing that in certain times than you do from actually making methanol.
Oh, really?
Yes, yes. Because people often ask, oh, aren't you going to suffer when the power prices are high? And we said, no, actually, we make more money when the power prices are high than
Having those
at any
multiple
time
streams of income, isn't
at any other stage in the
yeah.
in the production process.
I might have a connection for you up in the Townsville area that, yeah, anyway, we can talk offline
Right,
about
right.
that. Yeah, so policy-wise, so are you guys positioned so you can take advantage of the hydrogen production tax incentives?
Yes, that is actually, someone described it as the burning platform. We should have no trouble at Bell Bay,
Mhm.
but I think if we should be in operation by June 2030, which is the
The cut-off,
deadline.
yep.
Um, but in order to qualify, you only need to get to FID by that time. So we feel there's at least a couple more projects that should be able to make that deadline and qualify. Now,
Mm.
they may not get the full 10 years because there's a hard stop in June 2040. So if you only start operation in 2032, you only get the 8 years. But even so, we think that projects that can meet that deadline it will be very difficult to contemplate building anything if you miss the deadline because you'll be uncompetitive for a while anyway with those that do meet the deadline.
Mm.
It's worth a lot. In our case, we make at least 40 million kilograms of hydrogen a year from electrolysis. So at $2 a kilogram, it's a very
Significant.
significant additional source of revenue for us.
Yes, yeah. And we're recording this in September 2025 for anyone who's tuning in the
Mm,
future.
mm,
And the Australian government just announced their net zero plan last
yes,
week, I think it was. So a
yes.
couple of headliners from that. So overall, about $8 billion, I believe, and $5 billion of that was for decarbonising industrial facilities
Mm,
and enabling lower emissions manufacturing, 2 billion towards the Clean Energy Finance Corporation to continue downward pressure on electricity prices, 1.1 billion to encourage production of clean fuels, 40 million to accelerate the rollout of curbside EV charging, 85 million to help households and businesses improve their energy performance, and about 50 million for sports clubs to decarbonize. So that's kind of this high level summary
mm.
for the audience. But yeah, how what are your thoughts on it, and how does that kind of play into what ABEL Energy is doing?
Mm.
And I guess a side comment from that, we've seen so often the government's kind of made announcements of big dollar values, but when you actually look into how many organisations have been able to access that, it's been extremely small. So yeah, have you got any thoughts and comments on that? And then how is that going to be kind of accessed for, hopefully we can utilize all that $8 billion of funding?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think one of the important points is, when you start a development like this many years ago in our case, you were never quite sure what was going to happen in the future but you were pretty sure that whatever was going to happen, it was going to be mainly positive.
Mhm.
So you, as a project developer, you have to have this level of optimism that
Yes.
there's a general direction and that the government and the people want to go. And, you know, if you get started at various points along the way, you will get a boost. And this is just another example of that, where, you know, the government, to comply with the Paris targets and a whole range of other incentives, um, has yet again, you know, given what we're doing, a leg up.
Mm.
And in our case, as I say, the hardest thing is just to get the government to understand that there is this thing this great new industry that Australia could be involved in, producing green methanol, even though we make no methanol today. And as I said earlier, you have to try and help people picture what you can see in your own head, about the future. And it's much easier, for example, to look at a refinery today, for example, an oil refinery, and go, oh, yes, we could have a little biorefinery next door and it could use all these facilities and tanks and all the rest of it. That's a relatively simple um, stretch of imagination. When you're looking at a completely new industry like we are, you're asking people to imagine methanol tanks and a whole range of different uses for methanol in mining and resources and in shipping and potentially as a feedstock for aviation fuel that just doesn't exist today. I mean, there are analogies you could draw with oil um, uh, and liquid fuels generally, but it's still you're asking them to. So when these things come along, you're trying to reach out to decision makers and policy people and say, right, we know that this is probably earmarked for, liquid fuels that you're familiar with, but there actually is another liquid fuel that qualifies based on what you've explained and what you've laid out in the policy. It's just not what you're used to seeing. So, the cleaner fuels program, for example, we would certainly qualify for that.
Mhm.
Um, we've had a look at, the 6 different sector plans: transport, resources, electricity, and in many ways we contribute to many of those. Probably 4 of the 6 sector plans, we can make a direct contribution to furthering those plans. Whether it's, as I explained before about, being a large new load for electricity, for renewable power generation, or whether it's, in mining, being able to store liquid fuels on site. But when you haven't got access to green electricity, you have green liquid, if you like,
Mm.
made from green electricity, to power equipment and to store energy. So yeah, we're very happy with it. We have yet to work out exactly the best pathway for us as far as applying for perhaps some assistance from under any of those funds. But obviously there's a bit of work to do. It's only just come out. So
Yeah, sounds like, yeah, heading in the right direction.
yes,
Yeah,
yes, definitely heading in the right direction. Yes.
yeah. um, Anything else that you'd like to share with the audience about ABEL Energy and about your progress? Maybe perhaps you can talk about some of the challenges that you've had to work
Yeah,
through.
look, it isn't easy trying to start a new industry. We've been very much the pioneers in Australia. Um, as I say, it's not an industry that people are familiar with today.
Mm.
But all I would say is when people are designing or looking at what Australia could do into the future, it's really important, I think, to try and focus on what we're potentially very good at. And because we have the land and the wind and solar resource, and it's still a very significant um, biomass residue resource, making green methanol is what we're really good at. Most other things that we're trying to do, um, it's going to be a little bit of a struggle to get the scale because we don't have a large population base. So things like used cooking oil, for example, we're not never going to be a massive producer of used cooking oil because there's only 27 million people and we're scattered around the country. Whereas somewhere like China or India with 1.5 billion people nearly,
It's a
that's going
different
to be their
market.
natural advantage.
Yes. Yep.
But we have natural advantage, and this even comes down to, in a technical sense, what technologies we want to be looking at promoting. For example, we are very much about using biomass and gasifying it, because then we can gasify a very broad range of materials, everything from biomass even to plastics. Whereas if we use a very specific, product like bio oils, then yes, that certainly has a place, but it will never be done at large scale in Australia, because we just don't have, the people and the potential for scaling that up. It's just one of those. As I say, it's not to say they're bad things. That these are all worthy things to try and promote, even at relatively small scale.
Mhm.
But being able to
Try and
scale up
place
and make
your
a
strengths.
real difference, and also bearing in mind too that we can scale it up to the point where we can export a lot. And so I think one of the interesting things about the Treasury modelling that came out with the net zero plan was a reminder that probably over the next 10 years, our fossil fuel exports will decline quite significantly,
Mm.
either because we're running out of resource or because someone else around the world is doing LNG or coal cheaper than Australia. That should be a pretty scary thing for governments. I've personally been witness to the US. I was involved in the US coal industry when it essentially collapsed from 2012 onwards. And so US coal went from 50% of US power generation to today less than 15%.
Wow.
And all of the major players all went into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. So I witnessed it firsthand. What didn't get a lot of publicity here in Australia, but I could see. I don't think it doesn't have to be as dramatic here in Australia, but there will be a point where our fossil fuel exports and all the income and the revenue that we're so used to from those exports will start to drop away, more than likely. The nature of this is that, as you exploit a resource, it gets harder and harder and more expensive to mine that resource. So that's just the nature of mining. And of course, we have many other mining and materials we're mining now that will provide income as well. But I'm just saying, fossil fuel exports, if the Treasury modelling is in any way accurate, will decline by something like 50% over the next 10 years.
Yeah, gosh. Yeah. How can the audience follow what ABEL Energy is doing? Are you guys on LinkedIn or your website? Or?
Yeah, look, we've been a little bit quiet lately because we've been trying to, finalise our funding and so forth. But we are reasonably active on LinkedIn.
Mhm.
So ABEL Energy has a LinkedIn profile. That's probably the most up to date and accurate. We also have a website. So both Bell Bay Power Fuels and ABEL Energy have websites. But I think actually LinkedIn is probably one of the better. I mean, I personally find LinkedIn extremely helpful
Yeah.
in trying to work out what's going on around the world.
We can get links on the show notes as well. So the audience can
Yeah.
check those out. And just in closing, any asks of the audience?
No, look, I think I think it's one of those things where once we get going, you'll start to see things happening. But it's, as I said before, even the policymakers struggle at the moment to understand, what the role methanol could play, because we're not used to it. But I will say that I think it's a great opportunity not only for domestic use, but also to build a new export industry. We could be a supplier. I think Australia could be a great supplier of green fuels to our region. Ports like Singapore and other ports in the region. I think would love to see an Australian industry really take off, and our domestic ports like Melbourne and Townsville, and Fremantle and Bunbury. These are all of them could take advantage of this new industry as it unfolds.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful point to leave it on. So an emerging industry for Australia, and sounds like one we very much need, both from an environmental perspective, but also from a funding and revenue perspective for the government as well. So, yeah, thanks so much for your time, Michael.
Thank you, Andy.
Yeah, wish you all the best for your endeavours in the future.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning into today's episode of Exploring Clean Energy. I hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. I'm keen to continue to bring you the best experts and most interesting projects. So if you have an exciting story to share, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or email. I'm Andy Marsland, and hopefully see you next time.